How do you make a good tutorial? Well, hopefully this video can help give you an idea. For the time being, think about your own answer to that question and hold on to it until the end of this video. We can review it later. Now, settle down because class is in session for the anatomy of a tutorial. Also, if you aren't happy about this video's subject, too bad, you guys voted for it. Seriously, how did you all manage to get a double tie? What the From a purely functional standpoint, all a tutorial needs to do is simple. Explain a game's mechanics to the player, then let them practice what you taught them. Therefore, from a Doyleist's perspective, the most effective tutorial in existence is an IKEA instruction manual. It's a joke, yes, but not as much as you think. Most games from the early years featured simple text and picture tutorials, and you still see them today in more simplistic, mechanics-focused games or minor mini-games within bigger scale games. Like, I don't need super detailed instructions to understand a simple rhythm minigame. It ain't that complicated. However, this is exactly why so many games require more in-depth tutorials. Complexity. Technological advancements have allowed games to become much more complex, and they now include many more buttons, mechanics, and rules to explain. Since humans are notoriously bad at memorizing too many things at once, you need to provide more time to pace the tutorial out. Quantity of mechanics aside, there is also quality. Certain mechanics or rules might be unintuitive or highly complicated, which requires a lot of time to digest and fully comprehend. As a general rule, the most important element is time. The bigger and more complex your game, the more time the tutorial requires. The problem is, you don't have time. People are naturally impatient, especially when it comes to having fun. When a kid buys a brand new toy, their first instinct is to wrap off the packaging and start playing with it. The last thing anybody wants to do is read an instruction manual. That doesn't change even when the kid becomes an adult. The toys just become bigger and more expensive. Time ultimately limits every tutorial. You want more time to teach more information, but need to spend less time to maintain player attention. Spend too little time and the tutorial fails its job. Spend too much time and players lose patience and skip through it. This time restriction actually worsened thanks to the increasing prevalence of technology and social media. In fact, studies have shown the average millennial and Gen Z have an attention span of 12 seconds and 8 seconds respectively. For reference, goldfish have an attention span of 9 seconds. If you feel insulted by that comparison, don't worry, you'll lose attention and forget about it after 12 seconds from now. Look, a distraction! What were we talking about again? Rules and instructions are only just half of what a tutorial is about. In many cases, how to play is less important than what are you playing. A tutorial's other job is to introduce and show what a game experience is about. It functions like a prologue in a book or movie. These first 5 minutes aren't meant to introduce characters or show the setting or explain anything. They are meant to hook the reader's interest and show you how to feel about the story you are about to get into. Here's a couple examples to help explain. Do you remember how the opening scene of the first Harry Potter story gives you an impression of the story's general magic vibe? You know, the scene where Dumbledore steps out of the fog onto Privet Drive and shoots out the lights. I think I might have remembered something wrongly.
For example, Oculus Reparo. That's better, isn't it?
Let's try a game example. Five Nights at Freddy's is an example everyone should know. The first night serves as the tutorial, providing you with instructions on how to play, a safe area to try things out, and shows you what is the main objective and win condition of each stage. However, it also makes it incredibly clear what the overarching idea of the game is. You're a night guard trapped in a very claustrophobic room, and creepy killer animatronics are coming to kill you. The purpose of the first night isn't just to tell you the rules, it also instills into you an initial feeling of paranoia and tension, which the later parts of the game build upon to create shock and fear.
Oh, the sounds, I don't like them. Ah, fuck! No! Oh, no! Fucking fuck!
This is the foundation of that game's experience. Some more observant viewers might notice I use the word experience, not story or narrative. That's because the game experience and game story are not the same thing. They can be, but they don't need to be. There are games which have stories which have nothing to do with the game experience whatsoever, and their tutorials will reflect this. Overwatch's tutorial explains nothing about the story. Instead, it introduces you to Tracer, the game's perky British mascot, and focuses on your superpowers and abilities. What the player learns about the game experience is that the game has a cheery, Pixar-esque cartoonish vibe, the playable characters are superheroes with fun personalities, and using ultimates feels really cool. The game's story is completely irrelevant. Helldivers 2 doesn't really have a story, but their tutorial, which contains lots of comical violence and extremely patriotic encouragement, perfectly introduces the game's experience. Said experience being liberty and democracy. The game experience aspect of the tutorial is so important that many games go out of their way to design immersive tutorials which contain Watsonian in-universe reasons to justify why the player character needs to have things explained to them. Remember, the tutorial is often one of the first things a new player sees, so you want to make a good first impression. If your tutorial teaches the game's mechanics in a way which embodies the overall experience and does so quickly and efficiently, then you've got a good tutorial. So is this guy going to actually explain how to make a good tutorial? I'm sure some of you are thinking that. Totally fair thought, by the way. You might have noticed I talked a lot about the objectives of a tutorial, but not a single thing about the actual structure of a tutorial or what you should or should not include in one. And there's a simple reason for that. I can't. Or more specifically, no such answer exists. There is no such thing as a universal guide to a good tutorial. Remember what I just said? The tutorial is both a guide to a game's mechanics and an introduction to the game's experience. In other words, it is a distilled, hyper-condensed representation of the entire game. Every game is different. They feature different mechanics, are structured in different ways, and convey different ideas and experiences. That means every tutorial needs to do different things. Something which makes a tutorial outstanding for one game might be awful for another. Mega Man Classic explains each stage's mechanics through their level design by showing how they work in ways which don't harm the player. Some people, quote-unquote, praise this style of tutorial because it lets players naturally learn through observation without interrupting the game flow via pauses and dialogue boxes. If people were to blindly listen to such praise and opinion at face value, they might believe interruptions are bad and teaching through exclusively level design is good. But then we have Celeste, whose stages and mechanic tutorials are full of constant interruptions, pauses, and dialogue, such as its initial stage and the evil shadow chase. But these work very well because Celeste aims to deliver a narrative experience and also because it has a lot more mechanics than Mega Man. If Mega Man had Roll come in and tell you to watch out for this new obstacle every stage, it'd be annoying and not helpful. And if Celeste relied exclusively on level design and player observation, players might unfairly die to unexplained hazards and the game might struggle to deliver its story. The only times tutorials are identical is if their games share similar mechanics and game experiences, which typically only happens in games belonging to the same franchise. All mainline Pokemon games have tutorials that feel the same because they share similar mechanics and deliver the same experience. Same goes for all the Dark Souls games, all the Ace Attorney games, all the Mega Man Classic style games, and so on and so forth. This is why these tutorials receive such poor reception from longtime fans of these franchises. They have played these games tutorials before, but notice that once these franchises produced a game which changes mechanics, themes, or game structure, everything about their previously samey feeling tutorials changes. Legends Arceus, Elden Ring, Miles Edgeworth's Investigations, and Mega Man Zero all share similarities with other entries in their respective franchises, but their tutorials feel different because these games aim to create different gameplay experiences. The answer to what makes a good tutorial changes based on the game in question and depends entirely on that game's unique context. So despite this video being titled Anatomy of a Tutorial, we can't exactly study tutorial structures the same way we learn about human anatomy through dissecting a frog. The best and only advice I can give you is to regularly update your tutorial throughout development. It is a common mistake for developers to forget about their tutorial shortly after first making it, because it usually gets created alongside the first few levels at an early stage of development. As development progresses over months and years, the game's design, mechanics and experience will gradually change and evolve. The game could potentially change greatly within the time between the early production and eventual release. New ideas will get added, design problems will be identified and solved, old mechanics will get reworked or discarded, production plans get changed, and so on. This can cause the tutorial to very easily become outdated and fail to account for the most relevant mechanics or reflect the most updated game experience. This might seem obvious, but trust me, there's 1001 things to do when developing a game. It's very easy for everyone to be so preoccupied working on content or assets that they just completely forget about things which were already made. When you create and update your tutorial, think carefully about what you need to have it portray. Consider everything which your game is about and try to condense the most distinctive part of that experience into the tutorial. As for mechanics, identify the most important things you need the player to know and leave the rest for later. Take Ace Attorney for instance. Their tutorial cases only focus on the courtroom aspect of the game because the essence of the Ace Attorney experience is catching lying witnesses, pointing fingers, and shouting objection. The investigation sections are left to later cases because it's less essential to the core experience. Remember, your tutorial is the most important part of the game because it is what every player sees when they start the game. So maximize your time and hook the player's interest as best you can. Don't waste it on unimportant stuff. This is the main takeaway from this video. Write that down. Write that down! The lesson can be considered finished here. That said, it wouldn't be very fun to end the video on that alone, so here's what I'll do. I'll go over a few common tutorial structure archetypes you'll see in various games, explain why they are used, and how some games use them. Maybe this can be considered anatomy. The first place to start is with what I'd call the textbook building block. The overall tutorial is divided into multiple smaller tutorials, each focused on a different mechanic. They consist of a text instruction, a step-by-step guide to executing the mechanic, a few simple practice tasks to repeatedly use the mechanic, and some complex tasks which show some practical uses for the mechanic in-game, sometimes in combination alongside other mechanics. Repeat the above until you finish teaching all your mechanics, then give one final challenge which combines everything they've learned. Very straightforward and effective at teaching, which is why many games don't use it. I call this the textbook not because it's a standardized layout, but because the experience of playing through these tutorials is akin to reading a textbook in school. It's dry, boring, and is something you are being forced to do. Ergo, not fun. Anybody who plays this can obviously tell they are being forced to do a tutorial, and they will subsequently respond to your game with an appropriate lack of enthusiasm until they get it over with and start having fun. That said, this structure isn't bad. You shouldn't avoid using it just because it's boring. The trick to making it work is to accept that it is transparently and unambiguously a tutorial, so don't waste time trying to pretend it's something more than it is. Just get in, teach what you need using as few words as necessary, and get out as efficiently as possible. The player will treat the tutorial as something necessary and not think twice about it. Cuphead is a good demonstration of this. The game's tutorial is simple, boring, and only teaches basic controls, but it is very short. It exists purely out of necessity because the game consists solely of boss fights where the player is too distracted to pay attention to the basic mechanics. The game experience is instead handled by the first boss, who shows you that boss fights consist of dodging constant projectiles and have 3 distinct phases with different attack patterns. It also works well for teaching players stuff later in the game, because by that point they are already invested into the game experience anyway and should already have a foundational understanding of the game's mechanics to build onto. This structure is also an essential building block for the other, more complex tutorial structures we will discuss later, who use it to handle their mechanical instructions but retain player interest and deliver the game experience through other means. Next, we have the playground. In stark contrast to the textbook, which teaches mechanics in a rigid and structured format, this tutorial instead provides players with a safe, open area to move around and explore in. Instead of following a structured guide, players are left to just figure it out. They press every button, experiment with every option, and learn through observing what works and repeating that. There are usually no compulsory instructions, and if there are any text-based instructions, they are typically found through optional interactions with NPCs or signs. Enemies are present and can hurt you, but they are few in number, have non-threatening attacks, and are easy to escape from. Healing is also plentiful, so players shouldn't be dying unless they go out of their way to do so. This style of tutorial tends to be popular among easy, low-stakes games. These games may have a high degree of mastery and skill expression, but the overall game itself is easy to play and highly accessible to many people, so the tutorial can afford to be lenient with the player's learning. Take Super Mario 64 for example. The area outside Peach's castle serves as a playground for you to freely run, jump, and swim around in to get comfortable with the controls. Then, the first stage, Bob-omb Battlefield, contains a series of enemies and basic challenges to practice with. The next two stages then focus on more advanced, yet essential mechanics. Thwomp's Fortress features the ground pound and Jolly Roger Bay teaches underwater controls. This tutorial doesn't forcibly teach you all of Mario's fancy movement techniques like the triple jump, backwards high jump, or the long jump. And it's possible that a player won't ever stumble across the button combinations which use them. But those techniques aren't required to complete the game, so it doesn't need to worry if the player doesn't figure them out until later. The playground is at the complete opposite end of the spectrum from the textbook, and their pros and cons are swapped accordingly. It trades optimized instruction for maximum experience, making for a fantastic first impression but risks the player getting confused and lost with the controls. Mario and Sonic only mitigated these risks because they are so famous that everybody in existence loosely understands the ideas of run and jump, but not every game can do the same. The next type of tutorial is what I fondly like to refer to as Tutorial Island. It is a structured experience within an open explorable area, usually bound by elements like narrative, and the objectives required to complete the tutorial are designed as a hurdle to overcome. Additionally, when the player does finish the tutorial, they cannot immediately return to the tutorial area. There is either a physical or psychological boundary which separates the tutorial zone from the rest of the game, forcing the player out of the safe starting zone and into the wider game world beyond. They might be able to revisit the tutorial zone in future, but that won't be for quite some time. At the bare minimum, they can't just do a 180 and walk back. This tutorial well and truly is an island. As long as you are on the island, you have resources and a comfortable environment to learn, but getting off the island is a challenge in and of itself, and once you do leave, you likely aren't returning anytime soon. This structure essentially aims to combine both of the previously mentioned styles in a way which gains both their advantages without either of their drawbacks. Similar to the playground, this is a zone which provides players with fun activities to do and freedom to explore, and like the textbook, the player is taught game mechanics in a structured fashion. It isn't dry and boring like the textbook, nor is there zero formal guidance like the playground. But unlike both, the player cannot leave this zone at their leisure. To do so, they must complete a clearly defined, specific objective. This could be defeating a boss, reaching a certain level, completing a quest, clearing a dungeon, and so on. In many cases, finishing the tutorial is treated as a big deal and a notable milestone for the player. This tutorial style is popular for its effectiveness. It tests and ensures the player is well prepared for the game by the time they finish it, and can also deliver an engaging experience. However, the trade-off is time. Expect to spend a lot of time on Tutorial Island. The textbook and playground are short. A player can quickly finish the basic instructions or beeline straight through the playground respectively. They cannot do the same here. Because of this severe drawback, this structure is often used by already long games, especially narrative-driven ones. Good storytelling in general does a lot to help compensate for a tutorial's inherently boring nature. These games usually need a prologue to introduce story elements anyway, so you might as well kill two birds with one stone and make that into a tutorial. It's sort of like how you spend a chapter or two showing peaceful life in the village before you make the evil general burn it to the ground and stab the love interest like a hot knife through butter. Due to the general popularity of narratives in games, this tutorial structure is actually surprisingly common. Kingdom Hearts Destiny Islands is a literal tutorial island. It's a big area to run around in, contains practice fights against a couple kids, includes a low-stakes battle and platforming race against Riku for you to win or more likely lose in, and it ends with the islands being destroyed by darkness. Total time, about an hour. Kingdom Hearts 2 repeats this with Roxas's Digital Twilight Town, except now with even more meaningless secondary activities, and this time it takes 2 hours. Undertale's Tutorial does the same thing. The player is given a basic introduction to combat, overworld movement and puzzles, then stays in Toriel's house. They can freely explore the house, but must find a way to leave to continue the game. When they do leave, Toriel herself serves as a boss. She tests the player's basic understanding of dodging, using items, sparing or fighting, fighting and introduces players to the game's narrative themes and core game experience. This is achieved regardless of whether the player successfully spares her or kills her, because they are made to feel like a heartless monster for doing the latter. After they complete Toriel's test, the exit is locked and they can no longer return. I could keep listing examples. In fact, my original draft for this script included Metal Gear Solid 3 and Pokemon Rid's tutorials, which end after Snake gets thrown off a bridge and the player hops over the one-way ledge after Mount Moon respectively. But I think you get how this tutorial structure works by now, and the video is already long enough as is. Speaking of length, how about a tutorial that lasts for 15 hours? Instead of confining the tutorial to an island, here the entire game is the island. That would be the compulsory easy mode style of tutorial. The game is divided into two difficulties, easy and normal. The game is overall designed and balanced around the normal difficulty, but players cannot access that difficulty upon immediately starting the game. Instead, they are placed into the easy difficulty and automatically move into the normal difficulty after completing it. Normal difficulty contains all of the same content and enemies as easy, but enemies are made more difficult somehow, such as having new attack patterns and higher damage. This is an unusual tutorial style used under a very specific set of conditions. It requires a game to have theoretically infinite playtime and replayability, and a huge number of playable options to try out and learn. Monster Hunter fans in the room may find this familiar. It's their low and high rank structure. Monster Hunter features 18 weapons, each with their own mechanics and controls. That is a lot of options. It'll take a long time for a player to try out different gameplay styles and figure out what they like, and the need to constantly build and upgrade weapons means that trying out new things involves a lot of time investment. Fortunately, Monster Hunter has practically infinite replayability. The game consists of basically repeating the same boss fights from a giant pool of potential boss fights in multiplayer, so you won't really get bored with it. This tutorial structure helps mitigate Monster Hunter's steep learning curve by effectively making the entire 15-hour low-rank campaign into a glorified tutorial. It can introduce new players to the monster hunting fun with no delay while keeping it beginner accessible. Live service gacha games like Genshin Impact and Honkai Star Rail also use this tutorial structure for a different reason. These games have an overall account level which is independent from the playable characters' levels. This affects the stats and damage of enemies and the characters' max level caps, which may prevent a player from unlocking certain abilities. Bosses and enemies may have complicated mechanics, which normally require the characters' more advanced abilities to handle, but at lower account levels, their health and damage are so low that most new players can easily push through via brute force. The bulk of the player population is eventually expected to reach the maximum player level, and most content is designed around that point. However, gacha games rely extensively on attracting new players to grow, and developing substantial content which can only be played by veteran players isn't good for player population growth. But inversely, developing content exclusively for newbies, which veterans can just breeze through, is bad for long-time retention. The account level system aims to solve this by scaling all essential content to match the player's overall progression, ensuring whatever main story challenges they create can be enjoyed by players of all kinds. Naturally, certain content is level restricted and can only be completed by players at higher levels, but this is only a minor percentage of the overall content within the game. Most of the time, they just reuse existing enemies and bosses from the main campaign and just jack up the health and damage numbers anyway. To an extent, you could also argue that online matchmaking also produces a similar effect, isolating newer and less skilled players from the more experienced veterans until they gain more proficiency over multiple matches. This tutorial's biggest limitation is extreme length. It takes so long to complete the easy mode that it might as well be its own game. You need to fully commit the entire game structure to make this work. This can create a whole new set of design-related problems to solve, such as players mistaking the game for being easier than it actually is. But at that point, you are solving overall game structure problems, not tutorial ones. Games like Monster Hunter, Genshin Impact, and Borderlands get away with this because they have total playtimes which stretch for up to hundreds of hours and possess either infinitely repeatable content or regularly receive massive content updates. But not many other games can or should do that. Don't expect to see this on the average game which you pick up for cheap during the Steam summer sale. That being said, the game industry's increasing focus on live service model games means we are more likely to encounter it than we think. From the longest to the shortest. Next we have Training Mode. An essential feature for fighting games and shooters, the training mode is almost always completely optional, and the player needs to go out of their way to find it. The player gets a room against training dummies or AI opponents, whose behaviors can be set and controlled by the player. They are given an instruction sheet full of button inputs and they just practice. This is the closest we get to the IKEA instruction manual. The player can choose to either build the coffee table as per instructed, or just sit around and play with the wood, or just leave it in the box and never open it. Being fully optional is this tutorial's biggest strength. This frees it from the burden of needing to introduce the game's experience, and allows it to focus on being in-depth with its instructions. If a new player wants to understand the game experience, they just jump straight into a match. However, that is also its biggest weakness. The tutorial has abandoned its job of teaching all players in favor of only teaching those who seek it out. The overwhelming majority of new players will likely just ignore the tutorial and jump directly into the game without understanding anything. If we were to evaluate training mode based solely on how well it teaches new players, it'd be the worst tutorial style by a long shot. Training mode's saving grace is that it has a use beyond just being a tutorial. It provides practice which benefits those who already know how to play. Real matches can be very chaotic, and winning or losing is just as dependent on your opponent's actions as your own. The unpredictable elements, short duration of matches, limited resources, ability to die, and consequences for losing makes it impossible to actually practice a specific combo or action in a live match. Training mode removes all of these unpredictable elements and creates a controlled environment for a player to experiment, practice, and improve their skills in. They provide infinite health, time, and resources, full control over the training AI's behavior, and effectively let players simulate any hypothetical scenario they want. Think of them as something like Dragon Ball Z's diabolic crime chamber. You lock yourself in, spend time practicing inputs or experimenting to learn new combos, then go out and fight people online. Next thing you know, it's already midnight and several hours have passed in a flash. That's why they call it the hypersonic time chamber. However, this is still a video on tutorials. As essential as training modes are for veterans, they still do a terrible job of actually teaching stuff to beginners and are also not an accurate representation of what makes the game fun. It's honestly quite vexing that so many fighting games rely exclusively on them and nothing else. They really are at their best when present alongside a separate tutorial which could handle the heavy lifting. Said separate tutorial is usually the campaign mode. For certain reasons, this multiplayer-focused game decided to have a single-player campaign. Perhaps the creators wanted to include a story component or wanted to accommodate a single-player audience. The reason doesn't really matter. What does matter is that this single-player component doubles as a tutorial in some way. The player uses modified variants of abilities found in multiplayer, they fight CPU-controlled versions of other playable characters, and the enemies, bosses, and map layouts are designed to simulate multiplayer scenarios.
Oh, he got it? You think he got it, bro? You think he Daigo? You ain't Daigo. Oh, he Daigo! He Daigo! He Daigo! No! This not scripted, bro. He Daigo'd me.
The idea here is to kill two birds with one stone. Since the player will spend a substantial amount of time playing the campaign anyway, they might as well learn something useful while they're there. Regardless of the campaign's intended difficulty, at the end of the day, it is still a structured environment with pre-programmed CPU opponents. The enemies and bosses will always behave in the same predictable manner, and the player isn't really punished for losing. This provides much more breathing room for learning basic game skills compared to a multiplayer match, where real players can behave much more unpredictably and failure has actual consequences for the player and their team. The campaign often takes the form of a story mode, but not always. Fighting games usually include an arcade mode and racing games have a Grand Prix. Halo has its story campaign, Street Fighter has arcade and world tour, Mario Kart has Grand Prix of various speeds, Smash Bros has classic mode and the World of Light. Countless examples of this exist, you get the picture. Special mention does go to Splatoon though, because it showcases the use cases of the campaign style tutorial perfectly. The first game adopted this approach for its story mode, which consisted of missions which forced the player to use different weapons and specials, featured stage hazards which also appear in multiplayer, and had a final boss which tested everything the player learned so far. This was necessary because Splatoon was a new IP and general concept for a shooter game at the time, with an unorthodox set of controls, mechanics, and win conditions. Every single player was a new player with no established knowledge, so they needed to create a tutorial which would effectively teach as many players as possible. This showcase showcases the key strength of the campaign-style tutorial: engagement. You're basically making a standalone game as your tutorial. If that isn't engaging, you've got way bigger problems to deal with. However, that's also the key limitation. It's a huge resource sink. You are effectively making two games in one. Some assets might be shared between single and multiplayer, but a lot aren't. At least the easy and normal mode structures share the same content between the difficulties. The same can't be said for here. If a game does manage to succeed on both fronts though, the payoff can be worthwhile, because both modes act as strong selling points for the game. Halo's single player and multiplayer are both well regarded, and Splatoon's single player mode was well liked enough to merit additional single player DLCs in the future. At any rate, the decision to include a single player campaign is not within a developer's control. That's a production decision. Designers and developers just work in the tutorial elements because they're already making the campaign anyway. There's just so many considerations that go into building a great single player campaign which have absolutely nothing to do with the actual tutorial aspects. It's kinda unfair to evaluate or compare this to the other tutorial styles. I think that should just about cover it. Naturally, other tutorial styles exist, many of which are more specialized, but this should be enough for a general overview. As I mentioned earlier, every game's mechanics and experience are different, therefore they call for different tutorials. What sort of tutorial works best for your game is entirely dependent on that game's individual circumstances. The most important things to keep in mind are to showcase the game's experience, only teach the essentials, and keep things brief if possible. Alright, now class is dismissed. Go and get lunch or something.